Hey everyone, welcome back. In this part we're going to be looking at workflows. Now in the last video I said we're going to start looking at DB triggers, and we are going to do that, but I also have to be respectful of honouring my commitment to make this a beginner friendly series. So we're going to be explaining workflows from scratch, okay? So if you're already familiar with Bubble and you know about workflows, then this may not be too useful for you, but you may still want to join along anyway. So let's have a look. What are workflows? Workflows essentially are the logic and actions of your app. They are the behavior of your app. It's what it does behind the scenes. And this is really where Bubble excels. This is its real value, because the UI designer, there's lots of different UI designers out there. You know, Bubbles has got better and better, and over last year it's got really good. But there are other options out there. The same with developing databases. There are tools out there that allow you to do drag and drop database design, maybe with a little bit of SQL dropped in there as well. But in terms of the logic and actions of your app, as someone who's developed software for many years now, that all had to be done in code. And code is something that is learned over a long period of time. It takes a long time to develop. It's very tedious, it's very long-winded, and that's where Bubble's value proposition really is. This is where it really excels. They've cracked the nut that so many had tried before to enable you to develop serious applications with serious logic without the need for code, and using something called visual programming. And it's the workflows, it's the being able to put together workflows expressing your logic and your behavior that you want your app to have, which is really where the no code space has really took off, and Bubble is at the spearhead of that. So let's have a look at how workflows actually work in implementing this. So they work essentially by implementing a process of when and do. So in other words, when something happens, do this. And some examples are: when the user clicks a button, do save some data. When the user types something into an input box, do calculate some numbers, etc. And the when part of that are what we call events. So in other words, something happens, an event happens to trigger that, so that when an event triggers, then we're going to do something. So it's events, which are the when part. And the do part of it is actions. This is where you actually put your logic, okay? So when an event happens, you do actions, okay? That's essentially how workflows are put together. And we have a quick look at what that looks like in Bubble. So the when button save is clicked is the event, and the actions are the different action steps, the logic that you implement in response to that event. So let's have a look at this. We've got a simple form which looks like that, and the user can type in a name, an address, and the main contact first name and last name. What we want to do then, we've got a button for save, and when they click that, we want that to then save that record to the database. So how we're going to do that in Bubble is we instigate a workflow, so which is an event. So we tell it to respond to the event of the user clicking save. And the way that we do that is we click on saving the designer, and in our inspector we get the save edit workflow, or we can right click on it and select save edit workflow. Okay, and then when we do that, it opens up a new event, a new button click event for us. That's the event, and now we add the actions in response to that event. So when it says click here to add an action, we click that, and then we get all of these different categories of all the different actions that we can take in our application, broken down by different categories. Now, coming from a programming and coding background, when I first saw this, I thought there's no way that you can perform all of the different things that you may need to do in an application just in these things. It may look extensive, but all the things you've got to do in an app, wow, that doesn't seem too many. But in actuality, the way that Bubble works, it gives you a lot of control and a lot of customization over those actions. We go down to data, or things as Bubble sometimes calls it, which means things means records or objects, whichever way you want to do it. In this case, it's a customer. So we're going to create a new thing. And then we can specify the type of the thing. So in this case, it's going to be business entity, which we're following along with our schema, is where you store customers and suppliers. Okay, so we select that. And then we can say set another field, and what we can do then is to save, let's say, the name. So they've typed in a name, we want to save it, so we say, well, what is the name equal to, and then we can pick an option off the list. Now we're going to cover that in a moment, so I'll leave that there for now. And what I will do is I will just delete that action, and we'll come back to it in a second. So let's go back to the graphic that we started off with about the structure of our application, which is that we've got a front end, which is the web app built on Bubble, and then we've got the back end, again all built on Bubble, which is split into an API and the database. So let's have a look at client-side workflows, which are those that we've been working with so far. In fact, anything that works on a page, anything that you do in response to a user event, is a client-side workflow. How they work is that they run inside the browser. So effectively the end user is sat there using your app in a browser, and that's where the app is running, that's where the workflow is running. That means it's running on the end user's machine. So without getting too technical, Bubble downloads everything that you need to run the app, not the data, but everything that you need to run the app onto the user's machine through the browser, and then that's what it's being run on. You're using their computing power to execute that application. And it's predominantly, but not always, based upon user interactions on the client side. So this is what we call building the UI, the user interface, effectively, is that's what the client workflows are trying to deliver. Not always, but in most cases. So the other type of workflows that we have are back-end workflows that run on the server side. So they run on a cloud server. Now in Bubble's case, Bubble's cloud server is sat on AWS, Amazon Web Services. So when you run your app, effectively, when you run an app and it runs back-end workflows, those workflows are not executed on the client side on the user's machine. They're run on a web server, powerful web server, sat on a data center on the west coast of the US, unless you have a dedicated plan and you're paying the rather expensive cost for that. The rest of us are running on Bubble's main cluster, which is sat on an AWS data center on the west coast of America, and that's essentially where backend workflows are running. Okay, now there are different types of backend workflows. For example, one of them would be an API which you expose to another application so that some other applications can talk to your applications and so on. The one we're going to be looking at in the next video is database triggers. It's important to remember that backend workflows are no different than client-side workflows to the extent that it's a when and do paradigm, okay? So there's got to be an event in which you respond to with actions. In the case of database triggers, the events are things happening in the database, things being added to the database, things being updated in the database, etc. We'll look at those in the next video. Okay, and it's very important to remember that when you're running a backend workflow, that workflow is run on the server and there's a cost to that, okay? There's a cost to Bubble for allowing your app to run on AWS's server, to use that capacity, to use that capabilities of that server, and therefore Bubble are going to require you to be on a pay plan in order to execute that, because they have to pass those costs on to you. So therefore, if you're not on a pay plan, then you won't be able to execute your backend workflows. You will be able to set them up, but you won't be able to actually execute them. So that's something to bear in mind. But in this video, we're going to be focusing on the client-side workflows, and the back-end workflows we'll look at in the next video. So let's just have a look at our form that we've got to enter a new customer. Okay, and we've got the name, address, first name and last name. What we've got to look at is what are the steps that's going to be needed to execute a workflow to save that data based on the database schema that we've now set up. So the first thing is that the main customer record, the business entity, has to be created first, okay? And that's where we're going to store the name, because that's where the name of the business entity is going to live. And remember, we're also going to need to specify the subscription and the org, because remember, we're using this in a multi-tenant, multi-SaaS customer environment and a multi-company, multi-organization environment. That's what we set up all our privacy rules on. That's what our data schema is all pivoted around. So we're going to need to make sure that when we create the business entity record that we do include those as well. Very, very important. So then we're going to need to create the address record, because remember, we set up our schema with multiple different types of data, because there could be multiple addresses per business entity, multiple contacts per business entity. So the actual address itself has got to be stored in an address record. So we're going to need to create that next. And then the first name and last name for the contacts is going to be on a new contact record where we store the first name and last name. And then we've got to remember to also make sure that the address it belongs to a business entity. So the address must belong to a business entity. An address cannot be just floating around, it has to belong to it. Okay, and the same applies to the contact. The contact has to be linked to a business entity record. So we need to remember to do that. Now the other thing as well is that because we can have multiple addresses and multiple contacts, is that the business entity record has to know which is our primary address. Now because we're only creating one, we know which one it is, and therefore we can place the address record that we created into the primary address field on each record. And the same applies to the contacts. We can store the contact record that we create into the primary contact record. Now if we did a much more complex form where they were allowed to put in multiple addresses, obviously it wouldn't quite be so simplistic as that. So if we look, we need 4 steps in our workflow. We need 4 action steps in our workflow to respond to the button click event. Okay, the first one is to create the business entity record. The second one is to create the address record. The third is to create the contact record. And the fourth is to make sure that the primary contact and the primary address field are populated on the business entity. That wouldn't have been possible initially because we hadn't created these first and foremost, okay? So we create the business entity, then the address, then the contact, then attach those address and contact into the primary contacts and primary address fields on the business entity. Okay, so let's get going with that. So again, we can just do the start edit workflow. If there's already a workflow for that button, it will just open it up. Okay, and we're going to click here to add an action, and we're going to say data things, and we're going to say create a new thing. Okay, and then we're going to say business entity. And then the first thing that I always do with this is to specify the subscription and the org fields, because these are so important that these get set. I don't want to risk missing these out, because otherwise everything falls down in your SaaS multi-tenant environment. So we're going to specify the subscription, which we always drag off the current user's subscription, because we know that the current user, the subscription that they're using is the one that we must have to put the record onto. And the same with the org, which we grab from the current user's current org. Okay, now we can add the name. Okay, now where we need to add that from is from the actual input field for the name. So whatever the user typed into the input field, that's a value that we want. And this is why it's really important, by the way, that you do name your elements so that they're easily selectable, because in a point and click development environment, you need to be able to identify the name. So my naming convention, you can choose your own, is to have a single short reference to the type of element. So mine is just I for input. Okay, and then the name of what it represents. So I can always, if I know I'm looking for an input, I can just type I, and it's just going to list those in there. Okay, just something to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going to just type I and then name, and then I get the one that I want. Okay, and we need to grab the value from the element. And finally, we need to also add the type that it's going to be. Now, because this is a simple version of the form, we're just going to assume they're a customer, and remember that the type field was added as a list of an option set. So what we do with this one, we don't get the usual equal to, we get these different options. So I'll just say that we want to add customer to the list of types, okay? And then we'll hard code that one in. You wouldn't generally do that if you were giving users the option of customer, supplier, etc. Okay, but that's our business entity setup. So now if we have a look at our graphic, we can see that the next step is to add the address in there. So let's do that. So we're going to say click here to add an action. Okay, and this time, rather than go through the menu system, what you can simply do is just to say, just start typing in any part of the name of the action. So this time, create a new action, much simpler, much quicker. Okay, and this time I'm going to select address and set another field. And again, I'm going to be a stickler over this one. You've got to make sure that you do fill in the subscription fields first, the subscription field and the org field. Okay, and again we're going to grab that from the current users, current org. Okay, and then the next one, we need to hook it back to the business entity. Like I say, for my diagram, is we need to make sure the address knows which business entity, which customer it belongs to. So we're going to do that. Okay, now how do we know which is a business entity? Because we created it in step one, we need to say, well, I want the business entity to be the thing I created in step one. And Bubble makes that really easy for us simply by giving us the option for result of step one. Really easy. By the way, if Bubble starts to pop up additional menus straight away automatically at you, you don't need to go through those menu selecting things. If you've got what you need, which is a result of step 1, then just click off the menu, and provided that goes blue, you're all good. So the next one is then going to be the actual address, and we're going to grab this from the multi-line input, and again I've named that appropriately, ML address for multi-line input address, and we grab its value. So that's the address created, no problem. So the next thing is to create the contact record. So again, I'm going to say create a new thing, and this time it's going to be of type contact, and again I'm going to set the subscription up first from the current user's subscription, and the org from the current user's current org. Okay, and then I'm going to hook it back up to the business entity using the business entity field, and again I'm going to use result of step 1. Now notice now we've also got result of step 2, and that's because we added our address in there. So every time you create something, you then get a reference to it further on in the workflow that you can relate to, okay, that you can refer to. If we select that here, by the way, it'll go red because step 2 is an address and what we need is a business entity. So we just select result of step 1. See how the menu's popped up? We don't need any of that. We can just click off it, and it's like, provided that turns blue, we're all good. And then we need the first name and the last name on the contact. So first name, and again, because I've named these properly, okay, it's called it F names value, and then the last name is going to be L name value. Okay, so we've created our 3 records there exactly as we needed them. What we need to do now, just going back to our graphic, is we now need to carry out step 4, which is to hook the primary contact and the primary address on the business entity to the records that we've just created. So the way that we do that is we add another action step. Now obviously we don't want to create a new business entity, we've already got one. We need to make a change to it. So there is an action under data called make changes to a thing. So we select that. Then it asks us, what is the thing you want to change? So obviously it's the business entity, which is in step 1. So we can refer to step 1. And then we can change it. So what do we want to change? We want to change the primary address. And again, all we need to do is to point to step 2 because we created the address in step 2. And the primary contact, which is result of step 3 because we created the contact in step 3. And that's pretty much it. Those records are then saved. Right, so one of the big purposes of going through this, and what we'll explain more in the next video with DB triggers, is that we've got our list type on our schema, our pipe business entity. Okay, now it's entirely possible that you can do this on the client side. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. I wouldn't advise you doing it, and I'll go through the reasons for that in the next video, but let's do it anyway because some people do prefer to do it this way. I don't agree with it. I don't really see that there's a good reason to do it, and there are good reasons not to do it, but it's certainly possible if that's what you want to do. Okay, so let's add a 5th step into our workflow, and we're going to create a new thing, and this time it's going to be pipe business entity, and again we need to do the same with the subscription. I mean, other than the subscription, the org and the user tables, if you're creating any other type in your system, don't even question it. You've got to add a subscription and an org because otherwise it won't know which data it needs to look at. So we're going to then say the current users, subscription, and then the org, which is the current users, current org. Okay, and then we need to hook it back to the business entity, its parent record, its parent container record, so that when we're in the list and the user clicks on something, we know which record to go back to get the rest of the information. So as we've explained previously, so again that's going to be a result of step 1. Okay, and then we can just say the name, which we can just grab from the inputs that the user's typed in. So names value, and then the address, which is going to be multi-line inputs address is value, and then it's going to be contact first name, and then it's going to be if name value, and then obviously contact last name is going to be so not f name, last name, last name is value. Okay, and we've created our list type. Okay, so right now at the point of creating that, we've now got everything in sync. Okay, and that's great for as far as it goes, and it's really easy. And by the way, if you don't want to go on a paid plan with Bubble for whatever reason, if you're not at that stage yet, or you feel that you don't want to start paying the $29 a month to get access to, you know, if you pay it monthly, $29 a month to get access to the features of being able to access backend workflows and DB triggers, that will work for you. You know, if you want to do that, I will go through in the next video why that's not a good idea, but you know, for this purpose, it works absolutely fine. Now, we can't test this yet. Okay, it will work because it's pretty straightforward, but we can't test it because in our data we haven't added any subscriptions or organizations or users, and obviously our whole system, our whole SaaS setup with privacy rules and everything revolves around those things. So we need to set those up. So we'll leave it there for now with this one. I hope if you weren't particularly too au fait with workflows, that's helped explain things a little bit better for you. And if you're more experienced, maybe this gives you a clue about where we're heading. But I hope you've enjoyed it anyway. Listen, thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me on this. Take it easy, and I will see you in the next one.